I'm going to start us off here now with something that's sort of become common in other places, but not so much from the pulpit, which is a content warning. I say this for those who are unfamiliar with this concept. It's a way of giving people a heads up that something that might be discussed here might be uncomfortable or triggering or difficult. I do that in this context because we are going to talk this morning about bodies, about our human bodies, and some of the realities of the human body can bring up some feelings for folks, some things that might be uncomfortable or painful or difficult. And I want to name that here to say, first off, I hope that nothing that is shared is painful, but that if you feel the need to step away or disengage, please know that that is your right and freedom, and that you are encouraged to do what you need to do with your body to be here today. So with all that said, I am going to dive in to some facets of our body this morning and talk about things that we don't usually talk about from the pulpit. I'm going to share with a story that is a story about my own body, and say that when I have 3 children, and when I was pregnant with my first child, I had a really traumatic birth experience at a hospital, and that's actually a different story I'm not going to share this morning. But that was the experience and the memory in my body that I brought into my second pregnancy. And in my second pregnancy, I was determined to have a really different experience of childbirth. And so I did a lot of studying and reading and research, which I had also done in the first one, but I did some different things. And one of the things that I did was I learned about hypnotherapy. And hypnotherapy is an idea that we can learn how to tap into part of our unconscious mind through our breath and through other meditations. And so I practiced that during my pregnancy, but then still on the day of labor, I was giving birth at home. And on the day that my labor began, it was, as you might imagine, a lot to process and scary and overwhelming, and yet I had practiced this hypnotherapy, and so I felt prepared, and it was going fine until there was a point at which it wasn't. And I remember feeling overwhelmed, and with each wave of overwhelm, feeling more and more afraid and in pain. And a hypnotherapist that I had been working with came to my home and came to my bedside and came right up next to me. And she said, "Ride the wave. Don't fight it. Ride the wave with your breath." And I remember so clearly with my next breath, my entire body floating on a wave and feeling no pain. And with my next breath, feeling my body rise and float and feeling no pain. Now, I know that isn't the story for everyone, or maybe not even most, who experience childbirth. But in that moment, I learned something about my body and my breath. A couple of years ago, I wanted to go away on a retreat of my own, just like some of our church members are this weekend. And I wanted to go away from church retreats, which I've been on many over the course of my adult life. I wanted to do something different. And so a friend and I found a yoga retreat that we signed up, and we dove right in, and we went, and I imagined that it would be very much about yoga, which I'm not a particular yogi practitioner, but I've done some yoga. And it was all women. And when we arrived, we found out that many of the women already knew each other. We also found out that we were most the oldest people there, which again, in the church world, I'm still one of the youngest. So it was pretty different. And over the course of the days that we were there, again, I imagined that it would be mostly about yoga, about stretching and learning poses and challenging ourselves with, some of those yoga things people do are really difficult. And while some of that was there, what was more there was story after story that women told about their need to be grounded in something that was beyond themselves. Story after story was told of seeking, of searching for a sense of meaning, of community, of depth, of groundedness. And as the days went on, story after story was told of how being together in this group of women, yes, doing yoga, but being in a community where we shared our experiences of our bodies and shared our breath together. How transformative that was for the participants. And by the end of the week, I think almost everyone cried about how impactful that time together had been. Now, I share these stories because this isn't what we usually talk about in church. We don't usually talk about our bodies in church. Beyond the time when we stand at the communion table and we say Jesus gave his body for us, and beyond Holy Week where we talk about how Jesus gave his body for us, we don't tend to talk about our bodies. We don't talk as much about growth and pain. We don't talk about the moment of birth and how messy it is. We don't talk about the moments of death and how painful and scary they are. We don't tend to talk about our bodies. And so this series, this Lent, we are invited to remember our bodies. We talk over these weeks, we will talk about the experience of the body in receiving nourishment and food. And we'll talk about the experience of bodies who are incarcerated and kept from freedom. We will talk about the experience of our bodies in several different ways and from different approaches, but today we're invited to talk about our breath. Now, in the Genesis passage that was just read, we're reminded that when God created human beings, God breathed God's own divine breath into that first human. God took God's own breath and breathed it in to create human life. Out of the chaos that was, God created light and sky and earth and dirt, and God created human beings. And then God gave breath, which is what we call the breath of life. Now, I know I'm not telling you something that most of you don't already know. Most of us are familiar with the not one but two creation stories, the second of which is this one, which God gives breath. But how often do we reflect on what it means that God gave us, each one of us, God's own breath in that moment of creation? That it was God's breath that first animated human life, and God's breath which makes us alive still today. breath is this thing that happens all the time. All the time. We've already been doing it all morning without even noticing it. It's what is actually called involuntary system. It's an involuntary system of the body. And what that means is that for the most part, it happens without us noticing. It happens without our controlling it. It happens whether we pay attention or not. It even happens when we don't want it to. If you've ever seen a child try to hold their breath out of anger, and I think I remember being a child and thinking, I'm just going to hold my breath until I have no more. Well, I was not one of these children who was capable of this, but I've heard that what actually happens is that the child will just pass out so that their body can continue breathing. Our bodies want our breath, and so our bodies protect our breath, whether we want it or not. Now, this breath that God gave us, that exists whether we want it or not, what if this breath, this gift from God that animated us, what if this is the most divine part of us? What if when we say that we are created in the divine image and that each of us is the image of God, as was shared in our centering message, what if that isn't just an idea that's far away, or that we can almost see it if we tilt our head and squint? But what if it's an idea that exists in every single breath we take? What if that's God? What if it's in each one of our breaths? Now then, if that is or could be, then wouldn't it be right? Wouldn't it be faithful? Wouldn't it be faith practice if we learned to honor our breath? If we learned to care about our breath? If we learn to care that our breath was God. Now, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We know that God took human form in the person of Jesus, and this is called the incarnation. It is what we waited for through all of Advent. Right? We waited and waited for God to be born fully human and fully divine in this person, in this infant of Jesus. Now, even in this moment of this incarnate being of a baby, we don't tend, once again, to tell the story of what that might have actually been like, what Jesus' mother felt like, what it smelled like, how Jesus was born messy, and how it was painful, and yet how the breath was there from the beginning. Now, we know that babies are these incredibly vulnerable, dependent beings. We know that human babies especially are unlike some animal babies that are born and can immediately walk and run or feed themselves or whatnot, that human babies are born incredibly vulnerable. Human babies are born and mostly all they can do is breathe. And then they learn to eat and poop and cry. You know, that newborn baby cry, they can barely even figure out how to cry. But they breathe. From the beginning, they breathe. Now, I wonder, did Jesus, in his growing up, in his body, did he experience holding his breath out of anger or frustration with his parents? Did he ever experience nightmares and fear? Did he ever get so sweaty that he got heat rash on his back? or run and trip in a hole and sprain his ankle? Did he ever fall and skin his knees or break a tooth? What was it like in his body, in his breath? Now again, we spend so much time in church, and in particular in our Protestant tradition, thinking about and talking about ideas, theology, and Bible, and what do we believe? And don't get me wrong, that's important. But I wonder if we miss how hungry most of us are to have an experience of being in our bodies. How hungry we are to have an experience of being in our breath. Do we miss out on sharing together this mutual bodily experience when we spend so much time in our minds and worried about our faith? Now, I'll say I've been a pastor now for almost 20 years, and so you'd think I'd know the answers to some of these questions, but I'm still figuring it out. So way back when I was pastoring my own church, and I had a really, hectic week that peaked on Sundays, as you could imagine. And then on Monday would be the day that I myself would go to yoga. I would work all day Sunday at church, and then on Monday I'd wake up and I'd go to yoga. And I did that because I needed to find a way to bring my body into connection with my spirit. And I know that I'm not alone in that yearning. I know that I'm not alone in wanting my body to be a part of my story, but not always knowing how to do that. And so we go to retreats and we go to yoga and we work out or we do whatever we do, but I wonder if we can find a way to do it here. I wonder if we can find a way to be present in our bodies in church. I wonder if it isn't too mundane or too embarrassing or too scary to be in our bodies on Sunday. And so I wonder if we can learn from our breath and in our bodies. Now I'm going to share with you this question. I brought this question to a yoga master that I knew years ago. He was writing a book at the time about breath, and he shared this with me. He said that he feels breath is the most important thing to focus on to achieve greater intentionality and presence. He said because our breath is always with us, it's always accessible. There can be a profound impact when we learn to trust our breath and trust that our breath is always with us, that our breath gives us life even when we feel anxious or scared. He said that if it were him preaching before a congregation about breath, he would find a connection between finding faith in our breath and finding faith in God. Because the same way that our breath is an involuntary process that we cannot resist, our breath will be with us, so too is God. So too is God always with us. Even when we think we forgot, even when our breath is coming in shallow and fast, even when we're afraid and we forget to breathe, our breath is always there. So too is God. And when we remember our breath, we can remember that presence of God that is always present, always there, all along. The other thing that's fascinating about breath that I want to share with you all is that breath is not just a thing that we imagine being important, that there's actual research that shows the importance of paying attention to breath in terms of health outcomes and improved health. Now, I don't need to share all of that with you. There's hundreds of articles about how breathing exercises and meditation can improve ailments, everything from hypertension and heart disease to obesity and diabetes, that breath and paying attention to breath can improve our body's health. What if that is another way that God is present with us all the time? Now, a few weeks ago, I preached about how our scriptures call us to heal and be healed and to be healers to one another. And we pondered this question of what does that mean and what does that look like and how can I heal anyone when I don't know if I know how to heal myself? And now I'm not trying to say that there's an answer or that I have it. But I wonder, what if part of that answer is in this breath, this divine breath that God gave us? So we're going to take a moment. I know I sometimes ask us to do weird things, but we're going to take a moment right now as a group and practice our breath. I'm going to invite you to breathe in and breathe out. And so get comfortable, whatever that means for you. If you want to plant your feet on the ground or sit back in your chair or maybe even stand if that's what works for you. I'm going to ask you to breathe together. And I want you to choose a word that you're going to say in your mind when you breathe in. And it might be a word like calm or peace or grace. And I'm going to ask you to think of a word that you're going to think when you breathe out. And it might be fear or pain or loneliness. And now I hope you've come up with a word. I'm going to challenge you to stick to that word now for a few breaths. If you feel comfortable, you're welcome to close your eyes, but you don't have to. And now, all together, let us breathe in and mentally say your word. And breathe out and mentally say your word. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. Now, as you keep breathing, you might be aware of your belly rising and falling. You might be aware of the other breaths around you. You might be aware of your mind wandering. Keep breathing. Keep saying your word. And while you breathe, I want to tell you a secret. Your thoughts, as they exist in your mind, are far away from your breath. Your thoughts are far away from your breath. Not all of your thoughts are true. You don't have to listen to your thoughts. You don't have to believe your thoughts. You can simply feel your breath. So keep breathing. One more breath. And now slowly start to bring yourself back into this space we share together. know that in your breathing just now, we did this together as the body of Christ. We breathed in and we breathed out the divinity of God. And as we breathed together, we remembered our creation and the way we were each formed. Now, as always, we don't come at St. Paul's with answers, but we create a welcome space for questions. It's my hope this morning that in paying attention to our breath, that in breathing together, that we created this space of being open and prepared and grounded together with questions.